My name is Elijah Vance, and I am 35 years old. To my family, I am a mystery they both rely on and look down upon because they do not truly understand who I am. For 10 years, I have worked day and night to turn my father's modest hotel business into a massive international empire that spans across the globe. While I was building this legacy, my mother and my older brother Marcus were busy telling everyone in our Atlanta social circle that I was the disappointment of the family. They painted me as a failure while I was the one keeping the lights on. Yesterday, I received a phone call from my brother's wedding planner that changed everything. She told me that my invitation to his upcoming wedding had been officially canceled. Even though I was no longer invited, my mother Denise still demanded that she keep the $100,000 deposit I had already paid to secure the venue and the food. I did not get angry or shout. Instead, I told the planner to cancel the entire wedding right then and there. The planner gasped in shock and told me that I did not have the authority because I was not the groom. I calmly corrected her. I told her that while I was not the groom, I happened to own the hotel venue, the catering company, and the entire hotel chain where their 200 guests had booked their rooms. This story started like any other morning in my penthouse office high above the Atlanta skyline. From this office, I run EV Enterprises. To the general public, it looks like a private equity firm that specializes in luxury hospitality. But in reality, it is the corporate vehicle I use to manage the Vance Hotel empire. This was the legacy my father left specifically to me, which was a fact that horrified my mother and brother. I was sitting at my desk reviewing architectural plans for a new expansion in London when my private line rang. I did not recognize the number, but my assistant put it through. The caller ID said Chloe Royal Weddings. I knew exactly why she was calling. My older brother Marcus was set to get married in 3 weeks. Chloe's voice was trembling as she spoke to me. She explained that she was the planner for the wedding at the Vance Majestic Hotel. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window watching a hawk circle the buildings below. I told her to go ahead because I had been expecting a call like this. She was thrown off by how calm I was. She stammered as she told me that my mother Denise Vance had just instructed her to officially uninvite me from the ceremony. I felt a cold, familiar calm wash over me. This was the type of game my family loved to play. I told her I understood. Chloe panicked because I was not reacting with anger. She then told me the worst part. My mother had told her to keep my $100,000 deposit. My mother claimed that I had told her the money was a gift and that the funds should now be managed by Marcus for his other expenses. I almost laughed at the audacity. Chloe explained that she could not legally do that without my written consent, but my mother was threatening to ruin her business if she did not comply. My mother told the planner that I was unreliable and that she was taking over the situation. This was the final move in a decade-long game of humiliation. They did not just want to exclude me, they wanted to rob me as they pushed me out the door. I let a cold tone enter my voice as I asked Chloe to confirm. She was the planner for the Vance Hayes wedding at the Vance Majestic. When she said yes, I told her to check her email for my actual contact information. I told her she was no longer talking to the black sheep of the family, but to the sole owner of the hotel, the catering company, and the entire Beacon hotel chain. I asked her about the deposit again, and she explained that my mother was insistent that the money stay with the wedding. My family wanted to use my hard-earned money to celebrate an event that I was banned from attending. They wanted to spit in my face using my own wallet. I told Chloe to cancel the whole thing. Every reservation and every service was to be shut down immediately. I told her to send the full cancellation bill to my mother and brother. I heard her make a choked sound of shock before she agreed. I hung up the phone and looked out at the city I practically owned. My mother and Marcus were greedy, but they were not usually this strategic. This level of social assassination felt like it had the fingerprints of someone else. I suspected it was Marcus's ambitious fiancée, Dr. Becca Hayes. She was making a massive mistake. I turned from the window and looked at a photo on my desk of me and my father David Vance 10 years ago. He looked so proud of me. He was a legend who built an empire from a single motel, and he saw me as his true successor. I remembered his will reading 10 years ago and how tense that office was. My mother sat in the front row looking annoyed while Marcus kept checking his watch as if he was waiting for his coronation. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, read through the small gifts first, like the house for my mother and a cabin for an aunt. Then he got to the controlling interest of Vance Premier Holdings. Marcus straightened his tie with a smug smile. Then the lawyer announced that everything, including all hotels and assets, was left entirely to me. The room exploded. My mother screamed that my father must have been sick or out of his mind. She called me a child who knew nothing. Marcus was in a purple rage, pointing a finger at me and yelling that it was a joke. He claimed that because he was the eldest and went to business school, he should be in charge. He mocked me for spending 5 years cleaning toilets and parking cars in our hotels. My mother joined in saying I was just a behind-the-scenes person and not a leader. I stood up and told them my father knew exactly what he was doing. I explained that while Marcus went to Wharton, my father sent me to work. I had spent years in housekeeping, guest services, kitchens, and valet across the country. I learned the business from the ground up and understood the logistics and staffing in a way Marcus never would. My mother told me I would destroy everything and that she would never accept me as the leader. Now, 10 years later, my phone lit up with her caller ID. I let it ring and then put it on speaker. She was shrieking so loudly it distorted the phone. She asked me what I had done and told me the hotel had called to say the wedding was canceled. She screamed about the humiliation I was causing the family and how the Hayes family would think we were trash. I calmly said hello, and she demanded I fix it immediately with a lie. I told her there was nothing to fix because I simply withdrew my funding for an event I was uninvited from. I told her she could not have my money and kick me out at the same time. There was a sharp silence. She had expected me to beg for her approval. When she spoke again, her voice was full of rage. She claimed the money was a gift, but I told her it stopped being a gift when they decided to steal it and erase me. She called me jealous and said I could not stand to see my brother in the spotlight. I ended the conversation by telling her the wedding was canceled and they could pay for a new one themselves without my hotels or my money. I hung up while she was still yelling. I knew this was only the beginning of the battle. I told my assistant to hold all calls except for my brother because I knew he would be next. My mother called back and her tone had changed to a cold, calculating one. She tried to act like it was a misunderstanding and said that Becca's family was old money and traditional. She claimed they thought it was strange that the younger brother was more established and that Becca just wanted Marcus to look like the man of the house. She said it was not theft because we were family. I told her I was disrespected and would not pay $100,000 to be humiliated. She lost her mask and screamed that she did not care about my feelings and that I owed my brother. I told her I owed no one anything and warned her never to threaten the person who holds her finances. I then told my assistant to have the legal team freeze all family trust funds immediately. The silence in my office following the freezing of the accounts lasted only a few moments before the storm arrived at my door. My assistant Sarah tried to warn me that Marcus and Dr. Becca Hayes had arrived without an appointment, but they burst through the doors before I could even respond. Marcus looked like a chaotic mess with a face that was red and blotchy from sheer entitlement and anger, while Becca stood beside him as a cold and sharp force of nature. She was exactly the kind of person I expected to see wearing a designer suit that cost more than my very first car and carrying herself with an air of absolute superiority. She looked around my penthouse office with a sneer as if the luxury I had built was somehow beneath her. Marcus immediately began screaming and slammed his hands onto my desk, demanding to know why I had frozen his and our mother's accounts. I slowly removed my reading glasses and placed them on the desk with deliberate care before acknowledging them. He was spiraling because our mother was calling him in a state of total panic, but I remained unmoved by his outburst. I explained to him that the family trust fund was a discretionary privilege managed by the corporation and not an absolute right. As the chief executive officer, I told him, I had a duty to cut back on non-essential expenses. Marcus was outraged that I labeled his lifestyle as non-essential, even though his $5,000 dinners and mother's shopping trips to Paris were clearly luxury costs. He shouted that the company was worth billions, but I reminded him that I was the one who protected those billions. Becca finally stepped in with a voice that was cold and dismissive as she treated me like a disobedient child. She told Marcus he was letting me upset him, and then she turned her icy blue eyes on me to tell me the game was over. She stepped closer and used her family name like a weapon, mentioning that her father was Judge Robert Hayes. She threatened me by saying he had friends in banking and hospitality who could cause regulatory problems for my hotels. She even suggested a thorough audit of my office to intimidate me. She truly believed that I was a small-time manager who would be terrified of a judge. I met her gaze with a cold smile and told her I would actually love to meet her father. I leaned forward and suggested that when we all met, we could discuss why she instructed my mother to cancel my wedding invitation while trying to keep my $100,000 deposit. The look of panic that flashed in her eyes was incredibly satisfying because she realized she had underestimated me. Marcus was confused and asked what I was talking about, but I kept my eyes on Becca, who knew exactly what she had done. I pointed out that for a family so concerned with traditional appearances, her actions sounded a lot like fraud or common theft. She had viewed me as a mindless cash machine to be discarded, but she was finding out that the machine owned the entire bank. She stammered that I wouldn't dare oppose her, but I told her I was simply protecting my assets. I gave them 1 minute to leave before security escorted them out. Becca's mask finally shattered into a rage that contorted her face. She spat that I was a spoiled boy who was handed an empire I didn't earn and claimed I was just a bitter accountant. She pointed to Marcus and declared him the true face of the Vance family because he went to the right schools and had the respect of the community. She told me I was lucky they even let me pay for things because money was my only value. Marcus became emboldened by her words and stepped forward to tell me I had always been jealous of his popularity and his athletic success when we were kids. He called me a weird kid who hid in our father's shadow and accused me of trying to ruin his happiness because I was alone. I listened to his heavy breathing in the silence, and then I laughed a cold and sharp laugh. I stood up and walked around my desk to face him directly. I told him that for 10 years I had paid off his maxed-out credit cards every single month. I informed him that the respect he received at the club was only because I paid his dues, and the car he drove was leased in my company's name. His face went white as I revealed that he hadn't held a real job since our father died, and was merely a consultant with no clients. I told him I had also funded his 3 failed political campaigns and every single expense of his life. I turned to Becca and told her that the legacy she thought she was marrying into was just an empty shell I had been financing. I informed them that the party was officially over and called security to remove them. They stood there in total shock as they finally realized they had threatened the wrong man. Being thrown out was just the start of their new strategy. They couldn't touch my money, so they decided to attack my reputation and my father's name within the Black community of Atlanta. My father was a pillar of the community and a benefactor to many, and my mother still held great social influence. She began to poison the minds of community leaders through tearful private phone calls. She told people like Pastor Allen that I was unstable and that money was missing from the family accounts. Marcus played his part by sighing at the country club bar and telling people he was looking into where the family trust fund had gone. They painted me as a thief who was embezzling from his own grieving mother and brother. The whispers worked, and soon people who usually greeted me were avoiding me. They were destroying my father's name to regain control. The first real blow came from Aunt Janine, who was my father's oldest friend and a retired judge. She called me, and her voice was sharp and judgmental. She told me that my mother had been calling the board of her scholarship fund and claiming I had massive secret gambling debts. She said my mother was painting a picture of an unstable son who was trying to blackmail Marcus and extort money from him. Janine asked me if any of it was true. I told her with a cold fury that it was all a complete and total lie. She sighed with relief and said I was too much like my father to be a thief. She warned me that this was a public execution of my character and that I needed to control the narrative before it controlled me. She mentioned that the charity gala was the next week, and people expected me to be a no-show. Then the chairwoman of the Scholarship Foundation, Mrs. Sinclair, called me and nervously asked if I would bow out of the gala to avoid a distraction. I was being disinvited from my father's own event even though I was the main sponsor. I felt a white-hot rage because my mother's lies had successfully turned the community against me. I told Mrs. Sinclair the situation was clear and hung up. It wasn't about the party, it was about my family winning the war for my father's legacy. I realized then that I needed to burn their entire platform to the ground. I called my lawyer Henderson and told him the defensive posture was over and we were going on the offensive. I ordered a full forensic audit of every cent that had left the trust and corporate accounts for the last 10 years. I wanted to know exactly what it cost me for them to try and tear me down. I also ordered a deep background investigation on Becca Hayes to find every skeleton in her closet. This was about protecting my father's name at any cost. The gravity in my lawyer Henderson's voice when he called me back less than 24 hours later was a weight that shifted the entire landscape of this war. I had expected a list of my brother's foolish spending or my mother's expensive hobbies, but he told me we had a problem far bigger than Marcus's ego. While his team was auditing the main trust, they cross-referenced disbursements with other corporate accounts and found a massive anomaly involving a series of unauthorized wire transfers. We were looking at over $1,500,000 stolen in the last 6 months alone. The money had been funneled to an offshore shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands through a sophisticated route designed to mask its origin. This was high-level corporate fraud, and it was not the work of Marcus or my mother because they did not have access to these specific departments. Henderson revealed that a junior executive in the finance department named Thomas had signed off on the transfers. More importantly, his investigators discovered that Thomas had been seen on multiple occasions with Dr. Becca Hayes and was making large regular cash deposits. I stood in my office as the cold dread settled over me because I realized this was a professional internal attack. Henderson explained that it was a personal relationship and that Becca had been sleeping with this man in a hotel that thankfully was not one of mine. It got even worse when he told me that Thomas had already set up a new wire transfer for $3,500,000 scheduled to execute the Monday after the wedding. This was the same day she and Marcus were supposed to leave for their honeymoon. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity as I realized Becca was a predator who saw Marcus as her cover rather than her partner. She was planning to marry into the Vance name and then disappear with her lover after emptying our accounts. She had been assessing me in my office to see if I was a threat to her real plan of stealing the entire company. My rage became a cold, hard stone in my gut because she had declared war on my father's legacy. I picked up the phone and called my mother, letting out a weary, defeated sigh to bait the trap. I told her she won and that the public fight was bad for the company and the legacy. I invited her and Marcus to bring Becca to my penthouse that night to talk privately. At 7 o'clock sharp, they arrived and stopped in the foyer of my home with ill-concealed astonishment. My penthouse was a 2-story expanse of glass and steel worth more than their entire neighborhood, and I saw Becca's eyes widen as she realized the scale of my real wealth. My mother recovered first and glided into the room with smug pity, calling my home nice but cold. They arranged themselves on my white sofa, looking like a victorious family, while I let the silence and the view do the talking. My mother prattled on about how glad she was that I had seen reason after all the damage I had caused. Becca told me her father was about to make calls regarding my hotel's compliance, but would stop now that I was being reasonable. Marcus told me I had really messed up and that I needed to listen to them from now on. They were so arrogant and believed their smear campaign had worked. My mother accused me of slandering Marcus and said public opinion was not kind to people who aired dirty laundry. Becca told me they were prepared to accept my apology and had already spoken to the wedding planner, Chloe, who was willing to reinstate the vendors for a fee. She then demanded a substantial wedding gift of an additional $200,000 to compensate for their emotional distress. They had come into my home after trying to rob me, and were now demanding more money as an apology for me catching them. I acted defeated and told them the wedding was back on. I promised to call Chloe and pay for everything. My mother was thrilled, and Becca gave me a triumphant smile, believing the walking ATM was back online. I told them I would unfreeze the funds and even cover the apology fee for the planner. They were drunk on their victory, and Marcus shot a smug look at Becca as if he had won. They walked toward the elevator, believing they had won the war, but I called out for them to wait. I retrieved a thin leather-bound folder from my desk and told them I had a new family agreement to protect the legacy. I explained it would transfer the Atlanta house to my mother free and clear and give Marcus full independent control of his trust without corporate oversight. In exchange, I told them it was a final settlement that released me and the corporation from any future financial obligation. Marcus was thrilled, and my mother urged Becca to sign it. Becca hesitated and wanted her father to review it, but Marcus snapped at her not to ruin the win. Becca was trapped by her own pretense and relented with a forced smile. One by one, they signed the document that would become their own death warrant. The moment they left, my mask of defeat vanished, and I called Chloe to reinstate the wedding with massive changes. I told her to book the grand terrace and the rose garden, and to order fountains and excessive floral arrangements. I upgraded the catering to the prestige package with a caviar bar and a champagne tower. I ordered her to move Becca's family to executive suites and put Becca herself in the presidential suite for the entire week. When Chloe told me the budget was nearly double, I told her to send the invoices to my office marked as the Family Legacy Project. I wanted them to feel secure and confident, so they wouldn't suspect my security team was watching their every move. Russo, my head of security, reported that Becca was being sloppy, and that his team had recorded her and Thomas at a hotel in Midtown. He played a snippet of audio where Becca commanded Thomas to execute the $3,500,000 transfer at 9 o'clock sharp on the morning of the wedding. She was convinced her alibi would be perfect, and they would fly to Zurich before anyone noticed. Russo had everything, including photos of their meetings and a profile on a $500,000 condo she had already bought for her lover. I told Russo to let the transfer protocol stand because a quiet arrest was not enough for the lesson my family needed to learn. I wanted her to walk down that aisle thinking she had won. My next call was to Aunt Janine to invite her and the scholarship board to a private dinner at the Majestic. They were tense when they arrived, but I told them I held no ill will and wanted to double my annual contribution to the scholarship fund effective immediately. They were astonished by the millions I was offering. I told them my only condition was that I wanted to announce the gift as a surprise at my brother's rehearsal dinner in 2 days. I invited the entire board to be my guests to see that the Vance legacy was stronger than petty gossip. They were speechless and honored to attend. I had just secured the most respected witnesses in the city for the execution I was about to perform. The rehearsal dinner was held in the private Versailles ballroom of the Majestic, and I had personally overseen every detail to ensure the atmosphere was breathtaking. The entire space was draped in white silk and thousands of orchids hung from crystal chandeliers, while a string quartet played softly in the corner to create a perfect picture of two powerful families joining together. On one side of the room sat the Hayes family with Judge Robert Hayes at the head table, looking stern and unimpressed, as if the opulent display was merely adequate for his status. Becca moved between the tables with a light and practiced laughter, acting as the perfect bride and master of ceremonies. On the opposite side, my mother Denise fluttered around the judge like a nervous moth, desperate for his approval, while Marcus stood by the champagne tower already on his third glass and bragging to Becca's cousins about his influence in Atlanta. My own table was tucked near the front, holding Aunt Janine and the executive board of the Scholarship Foundation, who sat with quiet dignity separate from the giddy celebration. When I walked in, the room seemed to pause for a moment, and my mother rushed over to grab my arm with a wide and brittle smile. She dragged me toward Judge Hayes and introduced me as the hotel manager, but I simply smiled and shook his hand while noting his cold and dismissive eyes. I told him it was a small family misunderstanding and that I would not miss the celebration for the world. I moved to my table and sat beside Aunt Janine, who asked me what this was really about, to which I replied it was a matter of legacy. Soon Marcus and Becca moved to the center of the room to offer a toast, and Marcus looked flushed with pride as he handed the floor to his fiancée. Becca rose slowly, looking like a vision in white silk, and commanded the room as she thanked her parents and my mother. She then turned her gaze toward me with a wide smile that did not reach her eyes and called me a very special guest. She used a tone of gentle and forgiving sincerity to claim that I had proven what family was about by stepping up to single-handedly fund the entire event. It was a perfectly delivered insult that reduced me to my bank account in front of the entire community. As the room erupted in applause, I simply smiled and picked up my glass before standing up to take my turn. I looked at the triumphant faces of my family and the pitying looks from the board members who all thought I had been defeated. I waited for the silence to return and then began my speech by thanking Becca for her remarkable words. I spoke about how my father David Vance believed in generosity and supporting our institutions. I noted that he also believed legacy was about integrity and protecting the family name from those who would exploit it. I mentioned the vicious rumors about my instability and gambling debts, and then I turned my full attention to Judge Hayes. I told him that while my family enjoyed the joke of calling me a manager, I was actually the sole owner of the building, the catering company, and the entire Vance Premier Holdings Corporation. The collective gasp was audible as I revealed that I had grown the company into a global empire with 50 international properties, while quietly funding the lifestyles of my mother and brother. I told Marcus that every luxury car and failed campaign was paid for by my paycheck and not a family legacy. My mother stammered that this was an outrage, but I countered that she made it public when she slandered me to the community. Judge Hayes stood up and demanded to know why Marcus and Denise had lied to him about who was running the family. Marcus tried to claim I was lying out of jealousy, but I revealed the truth about the wedding cancellation and the stolen deposit. Becca tried to distance herself, but I told the room she was not after a name, she was after the fortune. I asked her if the name Thomas meant anything to her, and mentioned the junior finance executive she had been meeting at a midtown hotel. Becca shrieked that I was delusional, but I snapped my fingers and the double doors burst open. My security team, led by Russo, brought in a trembling Thomas who looked ashen and slick with sweat. I explained to Judge Hayes that Thomas was Becca's lover and co-conspirator, who had siphoned $1,500,000 from my accounts. I revealed they had a final transfer of $3,500,000 scheduled for the next morning, right after the marriage certificate was signed. Marcus collapsed into his chair as he realized he was just her alibi and a pawn in her heist. Becca lunged at me, but was blocked by security as Thomas crumpled and confessed that she made him do it. I had Henderson play the video evidence on the large screens showing Becca and Thomas planning their flight to Zurich. The ballroom fell into a suffocating silence as Judge Hayes asked his daughter if it was true. Her frantic denials were hollow, and no one believed her. I told Marcus he and Becca deserved each other, and then reminded my mother of the agreement she signed the night before. I told her the house was hers, but all trust funds and stipends were permanently terminated, and she was now on her own. I raised my glass to the room and told them the wedding was paid for as my parting gift before walking out into the night. The fallout was brutal, as Becca and Thomas were arrested for wire fraud, and Judge Hayes was forced to recuse himself from the bench. Marcus was humiliated and left with no income or prospects, and my mother was removed from her charity boards as the community turned its back on her. 1 month later, I stood at the scholarship gala as the guest of honor and realized that true legacy is about respect and freedom. The morning after the rehearsal dinner collapse was the coldest day my family had ever known, and the sun rose over an Atlanta landscape that had shifted forever under my feet. I sat in my penthouse office once again watching the city wake up, and the news reports were already beginning to trickle out about the high-profile arrests at the Vance Majestic. My name was being spoken with a new kind of weight because the community finally understood that the man they called a failure was actually the architect of their world. I thought back to the moment 10 years ago when I first took over the company, and how my mother Denise told me I would ruin my father's name within a year. She believed that leadership was about wearing expensive suits and being seen at the right parties, while I knew it was about the grease and the grit of the operation. My father, David Vance, had taught me that a building is only as strong as the people who clean it, and the people who guard it, which is why my security team was so loyal to me, while Becca's conspirators crumbled at the first sign of pressure. Becca had tried to play a game of shadows in a house I built out of light, and she never realized that every camera and every ledger was an extension of my own eyes. I remembered the look on Marcus's face when he realized that his entire life was a lease that had finally expired, and I felt a brief flash of the brotherhood we used to have before greed consumed him. We were children once who played in the lobbies of our father's first hotels, but Marcus always wanted to be the king while I was content to be the builder. When our father died, Marcus thought he was inheriting a throne, but he didn't realize that a throne is just a chair if you don't know how to run the kingdom. My mother, Denise, was the one who fed his ego because she wanted a son she could parade around like a trophy, while she treated me like a secret to be kept in the basement. They never understood that my father left the empire to me not as a reward, but as a responsibility to protect the thousands of employees who depend on our success. If I had let Marcus take over, he would have sold the properties off for quick cash to fund his lifestyle, and the Vance name would have disappeared within 2 years. Instead, I spent a decade working 18-hour days and traveling to cities like London and Tokyo to expand our reach, while my family was busy trying to find ways to take what I had earned. The $100,000 deposit was just the latest example of their entitlement because they truly believed that my money belonged to them by birthright. They thought that because I was the younger brother, I was obligated to fund their insults and their exclusion. Becca Hayes was just the mirror that showed them who they really were. She was a woman who saw the Vance family as a dying animal to be picked clean, and she almost succeeded because my mother and brother were so blinded by their own vanity. They welcomed a viper into our home because she had the right pedigree and the right father, but they never looked at her heart. I had looked at her heart the moment she stepped into my office, and I saw a reflection of the same greed that drove my family. The difference was that I was no longer the boy who would sit quietly and take their abuse. I was the man who had the power to end it. I thought about the legal agreement they signed, and how my lawyer Henderson had warned me it might be too harsh. I told him that mercy is for people who make mistakes, but justice is for people who choose to be cruel. My family chose to be cruel, and they chose to try and destroy my reputation in the one community that mattered to me. They tried to take away my father's friends and the charities he loved. That was the line they should have never crossed. By inviting the scholarship board to the dinner, I wasn't just exposing Becca, I was reclaiming my father's honor. I wanted those men and women to see that the blood of David Vance ran through my veins and that I was the one who would continue his work. As I watched the hawk circle the skyline again, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for 10 years. The accounts were frozen, the vipers were in jail, and the parasites had been removed from the host. Marcus would have to learn what it means to work for a living, and my mother would have to learn what it means to be a neighbor instead of a queen. I knew they would try to call me or send lawyers to beg for a reversal of the agreement, but I had already instructed my team to block every path. There would be no more bailouts and no more secret payments. The era of the walking ATM was officially dead, and the era of the Vance Empire was just beginning. I looked at the photo of my father one last time and whispered that I had kept my promise. I had protected the business, and I had protected the name. The city of Atlanta was still there, and the hotels were still standing, but the people inside them were finally the ones who deserved to be there. I stood up and walked to the window, feeling the heat of the morning sun against the glass. I was 35 years old, and for the first time in my life I didn't have to carry the weight of a family that hated me. I was Elijah Vance, and I was exactly who my father knew I would become. The future was mine to write, and I would write it with the same strength and silence that had brought me to the top of this tower. My journey was far from over, but the war was won. I would continue to build, and I would continue to give, but I would never again let anyone tell me what I am worth. The world would know my name not because of the scandal, but because of the empire that remained standing when the dust finally settled. I turned back to my desk and picked up the phone to call my assistant Sarah. I told her to schedule a meeting with the London team for 10 o'clock sharp. We had work to do, and there was no time to look back at the wreckage I had left behind. The legacy was safe, and that was all that mattered. The days following the confrontation in the ballroom felt like a slow and heavy settling of the earth after a massive earthquake had leveled everything I once knew about my family. I spent my time in the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse office, where the air was no longer thick with the anticipation of an upcoming war, but was instead filled with the steady rhythm of a global empire continuing to move forward without the weight of parasites pulling at its heels. I thought often about the look on my mother's face as she watched the screens display the evidence of her own undoing, and how she realized too late that she had traded a son's loyalty for the empty promises of a social climbing predator. It was a tragedy of her own making because she had spent 35 years underestimating the quiet boy who watched from the corners while celebrating the loud and empty son who only knew how to spin. My father, David Vance, had seen the truth of us both when he chose to leave me the controlling interest in Vance Premier Holdings 10 years ago. He knew that Marcus would see the business as a chest of gold to be plundered for vanity, while I would see it as a garden to be tended and expanded across oceans. As I sat reviewing the financial projections for the upcoming quarter, I reflected on how my family had tried to use the black community of Atlanta as a weapon against my character. They had whispered in the ears of pastors and judges, thinking that social pressure would force me to bend my knee and hand over the keys to the vault. They never understood that true respect is not something you can manufacture through gossip or expensive tea parties, but is something earned through decades of integrity and results. When I doubled the donation to the scholarship fund, I wasn't just buying back my reputation, I was proving that my commitment to my father's values was deeper than any petty family squabble. The board members, like Mrs. Sinclair and Aunt Janine, had seen the truth that night, and the letters of apology that arrived on my desk afterward were a testament to the power of showing rather than telling. Meanwhile, the legal fallout for Becca Hayes and her lover Thomas was proceeding with a clinical and brutal efficiency. My lawyers and the district attorney were working through the thousands of pages of evidence my security team had gathered during their surveillance. It turned out that Becca had been planning this heist for even longer than we initially suspected, and she had targeted Marcus specifically because he was the perfect blend of arrogance and ignorance. She knew that he would never look at the books and would never question her father's supposed influence because he was too busy looking at his own reflection in the mirrors of the clubs I paid for. The $3,500,000 they tried to steal on the morning of the wedding was supposed to be their ticket to a life of luxury in Zurich, while my company would have been left to deal with the fallout of an internal theft. I found it poetic that the very wedding she insisted be so grand and expensive became the stage for her public arrest and the destruction of her father's career. Judge Hayes was now facing his own demons as the legal community questioned how a man of the law could have a daughter who operated like a common con artist. He had tried to threaten my business with regulatory problems, but now he was the one being audited by the ethics committee. As for Marcus, he was experiencing the true meaning of the word failure for the first time in his life. Without my company card and without the trust fund I had frozen, he was a man with a mountain of debt and no skills to pay it off. He had spent years mocking me for scrubbing floors and parking cars, but now he was finding out that those were the very jobs that taught a man how to survive when the world falls apart. My mother, Denise, was living in the massive Atlanta house I had signed over to her, but the silence in those $4 million halls must have been deafening. She had the property, but none of the liquid assets required to keep the lights on or the gardens trimmed. She had traded her relationship with her only capable son for a title that no longer meant anything to anyone in the city. I received a few letters from her lawyers begging for a meeting, but I never replied because the agreement she signed was final and ironclad. I had spent 10 years being the family secret and the family failure, and I was finally done playing those roles. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the streets where I had once worked as a valet and a bellman under my father's watchful eye. He would have been proud of the way I handled the Vipers because he always told me that a man who doesn't stand for his legacy will lose it to the first wind that blows. I was Elijah Vance, and I had survived the ultimate betrayal to emerge stronger and more singular in my purpose. The Vance Hotel empire was no longer a family burden, but was a corporate machine that was growing toward 50 international properties with a clear vision and a steady hand. I turned back to my desk and picked up the architectural drafts for the London expansion once again. There were new cities to conquer and new legacies to build, and I would do it all with the quiet competence that had always been my greatest strength. The shadow of the wedding was gone, and the light of the future was bright and clear. The corporate world continued to spin on its axis as I dove deeper into the expansion of the Vance Hotel empire, and the silence from my family was a heavy curtain that allowed me to focus entirely on the future of the business. I sat in my high-rise office in Atlanta and thought about how my mother Denise and my brother Marcus had spent a whole decade trying to convince the world that I was a failure while I was the one building a global legacy from the ground up. They had operated on the surface of life, while I had learned the logistics and the staffing and the payroll by working in the kitchens and the laundry rooms and the valet stands of our properties. This foundation of knowledge was something Marcus could never understand because he believed that a business degree and a loud voice were enough to lead a kingdom. When I received that phone call from the wedding planner, Chloe telling me my invitation was canceled, I realized that my family had finally reached the end of their strategic rope. They tried to keep my $100,000 deposit and use my own money to fund my exclusion from the family circle. It was a calculated move that had the fingerprints of Dr. Becca Hayes all over it, and she had no idea that she was walking into a trap set by the very man she labeled as a walking ATM. I had spent 35 years being the invisible engine of this family, and I decided at that moment that the engine was going to stop providing power to people who did not respect the work. I remembered my father David Vance and how he stood on the roof of our first hotel in Atlanta and told me that the business was not just about buildings but about the character of the man who owned them. Marcus and Denise had no character, and they proved it by trying to steal my money and my reputation through a vicious smear campaign. They told people like Aunt Janine and Pastor Allen that I was unstable and had gambling debts to destroy my credibility as a businessman. It was a public execution of my name, and they thought I would crumble under the weight of their lies. Instead, I used my resources to conduct a forensic audit that revealed Becca Hayes was a predator who had been sleeping with a junior executive named Thomas to siphon millions from my company. She was planning a heist of $3,500,000 on the very morning. She was supposed to marry my brother. I watched as Marcus and Denise signed a legal agreement that transferred the family house to my mother, but permanently cut them off from every other financial asset I owned. They were so blinded by greed that they signed their own financial death warrants without even reading the fine print. At the rehearsal dinner, I stood before the elite of Atlanta and exposed every single lie and every single theft, while my security team brought in the trembling Thomas as living proof of the betrayal. I watched the color drain from Becca's face as I played the audio of her planning to flee to Zurich with the stolen millions. Marcus was devastated when he realized he was just a pawn and an alibi for a woman who never loved him. My mother Denise realized that her social standing was gone forever because I had secured the scholarship board as witnesses to her cruelty. They were left in the wreckage of their own making while I walked out of that ballroom as a free man for the first time in my life. The Vance empire was now mine alone, and the vipers had been removed from the garden. I spent the next few weeks reviewing the expansion into Tokyo and Paris while my lawyers handled the criminal charges against Becca and Thomas. My brother was left with a house he could not afford to maintain and a name that was now synonymous with failure in the city of Atlanta. My mother tried to call me several times, but I had my assistant block her number because the era of the walking ATM was over. I was no longer interested in being the secret that kept them comfortable while they spit on my name. I was the CEO of Vance Premier Holdings, and I was the true successor to my father's legacy. The community eventually learned the truth, and I was welcomed back to the charity boards as a guest of honor. I stood at the gala and felt the weight of my father's pride as I doubled the donation to the students he loved. True power is quiet and strategic, and I had proven that to everyone who ever doubted me. My mother and Marcus were relics of a past that I had finally outgrown. I sat in my office and watched the city lights and realized that I didn't need their approval to be great. I was already the man my father wanted me to be, and the empire I built would stand long after their petty grievances were forgotten. I turned my attention back to the architectural drafts for the London hotel and felt a sense of purpose that no one could ever take away from me again. The legacy was secure, and the future was mine to command without the fear of betrayal lurking in the shadows of my own family. I was Elijah Vance, and I was finally in control of my own story. The deep and heavy silence that followed the departure of my family from the penthouse was not a sign of emptiness, but rather the sound of a decade of lies, finally falling away to reveal the hard truth of the empire I had built alone. I spent that evening sitting by the floor-to-ceiling glass in my office watching the lights of Atlanta shimmer like diamonds on black velvet, and I realized that my mother Denise and my brother Marcus had never actually seen me at all because they were too busy looking at what they could take from me. For 10 long years I had been the silent engine of the Vance family legacy, transforming a small collection of local hotels into an international powerhouse that commanded respect in every major city from London to Tokyo. While I was navigating complex global mergers and mastering the logistics of luxury hospitality, my own flesh and blood were busy painting a picture of me as a failure and an unstable black sheep to anyone who would listen in our social circles. The irony was almost overwhelming because the very lifestyle they used to look down on me was entirely financed by the labor they claimed I was incapable of performing. When the wedding planner Chloe called to tell me that my mother had officially canceled my invitation to Marcus's wedding, I felt a strange sense of relief because the mask of family unity had finally been discarded. My mother's demand to keep my $100,000 deposit while simultaneously banning me from the event was the ultimate act of predatory entitlement. She truly believed that she could erase my existence while keeping my wallet open to fund her perfect vision of a family that didn't include me. I remembered how my father David Vance used to tell me that a man who doesn't respect the source of his water will eventually die of thirst, and I watched that prophecy come true for my brother and mother. They had treated me as a walking automated teller machine for so long that they forgot the machine was actually the owner of the bank. When I gave the order to Chloe to cancel every single reservation at the Vance Majestic and the Beacon Hotel chain, I wasn't just reacting with anger, I was exercising the quiet power I had spent my entire adult life accumulating. My family had underestimated the boy who spent 5 years scrubbing toilets and parking cars because they didn't realize those were the years I was learning every single vulnerability in the system they hoped to inherit. They thought business was about the right schools and the right country clubs, but I knew it was about the payroll and the supply chains and the loyalty of the people who actually do the work. Dr. Becca Hayes thought she was the smartest person in the room because she had a judge for a father and a medical degree, but she was blinded by her own arrogance. She viewed the Vance family as a soft target and Marcus as a gullible pawn she could use to gain access to the millions she intended to steal with her lover Thomas. She didn't realize that my security team, led by a former Secret Service agent, was watching her every move from the moment she threatened my business in my own office. While she was planning her flight to Zurich with $3,500,000 of my money, I was preparing a public execution of her character and the social standing of my mother and brother. I had Henderson, my father's trusted lawyer, perform a forensic audit that tracked every unauthorized wire transfer she had forced Thomas to execute. The evidence was so overwhelming and so surgical that there was no path for escape for any of them. I invited the board of the Scholarship Foundation to the rehearsal dinner because I wanted the most respected voices in Atlanta to witness the moment the truth came to light. I watched my mother flutter around Judge Hayes, trying to secure her future through a marriage that was built on a foundation of theft and infidelity. When I stood up to give my toast, I wasn't just speaking to the room, I was speaking to the memory of my father, to let him know his legacy was finally safe from the people who sought to diminish it. I revealed that I was the sole owner of everything they claimed as their own, and I watched the color drain from their faces as the reality of their poverty set in. The legal agreement my mother and brother signed in their greed was the final nail in the coffin because it gave them the house but stripped away the millions required to maintain their pretenses. My brother Marcus, who always bragged about being the athlete and the popular one, was reduced to a man with no prospects and a mountain of debt he could never pay back. My mother Denise, who valued her social standing above her own son's heart, was removed from every board and shunned by every person who once sought her favor. I stood in the aftermath of the storm and realized that true power is not found in the noise of a crowd or the status of a title, but in the quiet competence of a man who knows exactly who he is. I had spent 35 years being the family disappointment, but I emerged as the only one left standing when the lies were burned away. The Vance Hotel empire continued to grow and expand into new territories because the man at the helm was no longer distracted by the weight of a family that despised his worth. I raised a glass of water to the skyline and felt a profound sense of freedom because I had finally stopped being a walking ATM and started being the master of my own destiny. The story of Elijah Vance was no longer a secret or a tragedy, but was a testament to the fact that integrity and patience will always outlast greed and vanity. I turned back to my desk and picked up the phone to continue building the future my father knew I was capable of achieving long before anyone else believed in me. The cold clarity of my victory did not bring a sudden rush of joy, but rather a deep sense of finality as I sat in the quiet of my penthouse watching the city of Atlanta stretch out beneath me like a map of my own making. I realized that for 35 years I had lived in a state of emotional debt to a family that never intended to pay me back in anything but humiliation and greed. For 10 years I had acted as the invisible architect of the Vance Hotel empire, transforming a modest collection of regional properties into an international titan of luxury hospitality, while my mother Denise and my brother Marcus treated me like a shameful secret. They had spent an entire decade telling our community that I was a failure and a disappointment, while they were simultaneously using my corporate credit cards to fund every meal and every luxury they enjoyed. When the wedding planner, Chloe, called me to deliver the news that my invitation had been officially revoked by my mother, I felt the last cord of my patience snap. My mother's demand to keep my $100,000 deposit for an event I was no longer permitted to attend was the ultimate proof that she viewed me only as a source of capital and never as a son. I sat in my office at EV Enterprises, surrounded by the architectural plans for our massive London expansion, and I realized that the time for quiet endurance had passed. My father, David Vance, had left me the controlling interest in the company because he knew that I was the only one who understood the grit and the logistics of the business from the ground up. He had sent me to work in the kitchens and the laundry rooms while he sent Marcus to business school, and that education in the real world had given me the power to see the vipers in my own home. Dr. Becca Hayes thought she was entering a family of weak fools she could easily manipulate, but she never saw the man in the penthouse who was monitoring every single wire transfer and every secret meeting. She had corrupted a junior executive named Thomas and siphoned $1,500,000 from my accounts, believing that her father's status as a judge would protect her from any consequences. She was a predator who viewed my brother as a shield and an alibi for her grand heist of $3,500,000, which was set to occur the morning after the wedding. I allowed her to believe she had won when I invited them all to my home to sign a final legal settlement that appeared to give them everything they wanted. In their blind greed, they signed an agreement that granted my mother the Atlanta house, but permanently terminated every other cent of financial support they received from my corporation. They were so focused on the immediate win that they didn't realize they were signing their own eviction, notices from the life of luxury I had provided for them. The rehearsal dinner at the Vance Majestic was the stage for their final act of arrogance, where Becca publicly insulted me by thanking me for my money while excluding me from the family photo. I stood up in that ballroom before the most influential leaders in the city and dismantled their lies with surgical precision. I revealed that I was the sole owner of the hotel they stood in and the empire they claimed as their own. I exposed Becca's affair with Thomas and her plan to rob the family, which I proved by playing the surveillance audio for every guest to hear. I watched the color drain from the faces of my mother and brother as the reality of their poverty and their public shame took hold. Marcus collapsed into a seat as he realized he was just a pawn for a woman who was planning to abandon him for a life in Zurich with a common thief. My mother Denise, who valued her social standing above all else, watched her reputation dissolve in a single night as the scholarship board witnessed her cruelty and her complicity. I walked out of that ballroom and into a future where I was finally free from the burden of their entitlement. The legal fallout saw Becca and Thomas arrested for wire fraud and conspiracy, while Judge Hayes was forced into a humiliating retirement under the shadow of his daughter's crimes. My brother was left with a mansion he could not maintain and a mountain of debt that I would no longer bail him out of. My mother was shunned by the very community she tried to turn against me, and she was left to wander the halls of her expensive home in a silence of her own making. 1 month later, I stood at the scholarship gala as the guest of honor, no longer the failure or the black sheep, but the man who had protected a legacy of integrity. I looked out at the sea of faces and realized that true power is not found in the status of a name, but in the quiet strength of a man who knows his own worth. I was Elijah Vance, and I had built a kingdom that would stand long after the vipers were forgotten. The final chapter of this long and painful journey began with a morning that felt remarkably lighter as the weight of my family's constant betrayal had finally been lifted from my shoulders for good. I sat in my penthouse office looking out at the sprawling horizon of Atlanta, and I realized that the silence surrounding me was no longer a sign of isolation, but a symbol of the peace I had earned through a decade of quiet labor and strategic patience. For 10 years I had allowed my mother Denise and my brother Marcus to believe they were the masters of the Vance destiny, while I was the one working 18-hour days to transform a struggling regional hotel business into a global empire that commanded respect in every major capital. They had spent that same decade mocking my worth and telling the world that I was a failure because I chose to learn the business from the laundry rooms and kitchens instead of just sitting in a boardroom. When they conspired with Dr. Becca Hayes to cancel my invitation to the wedding while attempting to steal my $100,000 deposit, they thought they were making a final power move to put the family failure in his place. They never realized that the person they were trying to rob was actually the man who owned the very ground they stood upon and the very air they breathed within the Vance Majestic. I remembered the look of pure, unadulterated shock on my mother's face at the rehearsal dinner when I revealed that I was the sole owner of Vance Premier Holdings and that I had been the one funding their luxury cars and failed political campaigns for the last 10 years. The revelation that Becca was a predator who had been sleeping with a junior executive named Thomas to siphon millions from my company was the final blow that shattered their house of cards forever. As the legal fallout intensified, Becca and Thomas were arrested for wire fraud and conspiracy, while Judge Hayes was forced into a humiliating retirement that left his lifelong reputation in complete tatters. My brother Marcus was left at the altar and abandoned by a woman who only saw him as a gullible pawn, and he was now facing a future with no income and a mountain of debt that I would never again pay off. My mother Denise had her house, but she had lost every cent of the trust funds and stipends that allowed her to maintain her hollow social status in the city of Atlanta. They had signed their own financial death warrants in a moment of greed, and they were now left to wander the empty halls of a life built on a son's generosity that they had never bothered to respect. 1 month later, I stood at the scholarship gala as the guest of honor and felt the presence of my father David Vance beside me as I doubled the donation to the students he cared for so deeply. I looked out at the sea of faces who now understood the truth of my character, and I realized that true legacy is not about the noise of a name, but about the integrity of the man who carries it. My family had tried to use my money to celebrate my exclusion, but they ended up losing everything to the very man they claimed was nothing. I was no longer the walking automated teller machine for people who despised my success because I was now a man who was completely and truly free. The Vance Hotel empire continued to reach new heights as I opened properties in London and Tokyo, while Marcus and Denise became mere footnotes in the history of a city that had once bowed to their every whim. I had protected my father's name from the vipers who sought to diminish it, and I had proven that quiet competence and strategic patience are the real foundations of power. As I raised my glass to the future, I knew that my worth was no longer a question to be answered by people who were incapable of seeing it. I was Elijah Vance, and my empire was just beginning to touch the corners of the world, while the wreckage of my family's greed was left far behind me in the shadows of the past. This was the ultimate victory of the son, who worked while the others merely wished, and it was a lesson that the community of Atlanta would never forget. I turned back to my desk to focus on the work that truly mattered because I had finally learned that silence is the best response to a world that underestimates you until you own it all. My father's photograph seemed to smile back at me as I closed the book on the family who tried to erase me, but instead erased themselves. Outro, this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.